just in case you forgot, we're Knoxville History Project, researching, preserving, and promoting the history and culture of Knoxville, Tennessee. Love, know, and love as well. And of course, if you want to go back and listen to a program that we did that you want to catch up with, go to our Engage page, and then you can find us under History Happy Hour. And I think we've got 60 or 70 sessions. So if you're bored one day and it's raining and you can't get out, want to catch up on a little history, it's all there for you. Um, we also encourage you to make a donation to support our work or buy a book or some merchandise from our website. We are a nonprofit and we appreciate everything that you do to support us and help us along in our mission. So that's enough for me tonight. I'm going to hand it over to Jack and help with the images. Good, Jack.
All right. Thanks a lot, Paul, and thanks as always for setting up the imagery for these presentations. Paul does this photo research and image research, and puts together the great slideshow that he always has to go along with my narrative. But Thanksgiving is a pretty fascinating holiday, as almost all holidays are, in part because it changes so much often without people being aware of it. And Thanksgiving also has a bit of a mystery to it too. We all we know about Thanksgiving when we think about the Pilgrims at Cape Cod and at Plymouth Rock and all that. And Paul, we have an image of that, don't we? And in the Thanksgiving of 1621, and we assume that it's been celebrated since colonial days, and they're all kind of paying homage to this event in 1621, which doesn't have a date. They had some kind of an end of harvest season celebratory feast with the Native Americans who were friendly to them at the time, but we don't know a whole lot more about it. Don't know what date. Don't know if it was in November. Don't know whether it was on Thursday or whatever. It was sometime in the fall, probably. But when you learn more about Thanksgiving and its history, it gets more complicated. And as you study into it, look into the Wikipedia version of Thanksgiving, you find out that it was originally more of a New England observance to begin with, and not that well known in the rest of the nation. And it really didn't catch on in the South at all. At least that's what some people claim, and not in Tennessee until 1855. But if you go further into it, dig a bit farther, as we have for this work, and for a new column we're going to have out by the end of the week, it's even more complicated than that, and surprising, and with a bit of a mystery too. Some days proclaim Thanksgiving during the Revolutionary War and soon afterwards, but not always in late November. And it was not until George Washington declared a Thanksgiving in a 1789 address that some people consider a precursor of our Thanksgiving, because it was on a Thursday at the end of November in 1789 rather. And this was the year that Washington was inaugurated as our first president. And that was, of course, up in New York. New York was the capital of the United States for a year or so before it migrated to Philadelphia, and then, of course, to Washington after Washington's administration. It had been suggested to him by Congress that he declare a day of Thanksgiving, a day of public Thanksgiving and prayer. Now, to give you some context in Knoxville history, this was James White and his family and allies were living here in 1789, but Knoxville's not founded until 2 years later. So this is all kind of pre-Knoxville. Anyway, this is an interesting speech to read that George Washington gave this talk, Day of Public Thanksgiving and Prayer, to be devoted by the people of these states to the service of the great and glorious being who is the beneficent author of all the good that was, is, and shall be. Washington's address included some language that might cause problems for a president today. He said that we may then unite in most humbly offering our prayers and supplications to the great Lord and ruler of nations, and beseech him to pardon our national and other transgressions. Can you imagine any president today admitting that America makes national transgressions and has to pray about them? It would get him in trouble today. He gave this long speech, and it's notable. A lot of people see this as kind of the original Thanksgiving Declaration in 1789. He has no mention whatsoever of any pilgrims or the Massachusetts colony or anything. And I'm rather interested in whether this might reflect another holiday that was going on at the same time. That first Thanksgiving was held on November 26th, Thursday, November 26th, 1789, the day after something called Evacuation Day. And this has nothing to do with your digestion, but Evacuation Day was once a major holiday in New York. That was celebrated the day that the final British troops left town in 1783. And Evacuation Day was always held on November 25th. And some people say Evacuation Day was subsumed by Thanksgiving as years went by. But I wonder whether Thanksgiving was actually plotted then because of Evacuation Day, that it was a big holiday that 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 happened then, and they decided to have Thanksgiving after that to kind of celebrate this event of just 6 years earlier that had been the departure of the British. So that's interesting. Anyway, this speech would be reprinted in Knoxville with some sense of significance more than half a century later. Um, there were some so-called Thanksgiving events, small T Thanksgiving events in the 1790s and later in Knoxville, but it's not clear at all that these were related to the holiday we know today. Some of them were in the summertime, and they were often just like meetings or prayer meetings. But it's interesting that George Ralstone, who was editor of the Knoxville Gazette, was from Massachusetts and certainly would have known about Thanksgiving. He was our main journalist here in the early days of the city, but rarely or never mentioned Thanksgiving, and in any case died in 1804. Um, President Washington called for a few more Thanksgivings, not all of them in November. One was in February of 1795, but still on a Thursday. He always picked a Thursday for his Thanksgiving proclamations. They say that a lot of the early celebrations of Thanksgiving and today were in the middle of the week to try to avoid confusing Thanksgiving with the Sabbath, with something on the weekend. That it should be something extra in the week and should not be just going along with the usual Thanksgiving that goes on a Sunday in a church. President Adams liked Thanksgiving, but Jefferson, interestingly, politely but firmly declined to acknowledge Thanksgiving. He said because it smacked of establishing a national religion, and he did not think it was a good idea to celebrate Thanksgiving, or at least for a president to declare Thanksgiving for the whole nation. Locals, though, here in Tennessee did become aware of the fact that New England and later the state of New York were celebrating Thanksgiving up in the north. And we know that they were aware of it because there are references in some fictional stories that were set in the Northeast. I think we kind of gleaned something both from newcomers to town, and there were a lot of people from New England and Knoxville in the early 1800s, but also from the stories that were published in the newspaper and also in books that were available here. In 1819, the Knoxville Press reported that Governor DeWitt Clinton of New York had declared it a Thanksgiving holiday, along with there was a Connecticut declaration independently of that. But there's something rather remarkable that came along. It has to do with journalism. Journalism had to do with changing a lot of things, and the main weekly paper in Knoxville was called the Knoxville Gazette. And we just saw briefly an image of a guy named Frederick Heiskell, who was from Maryland, and he might have had a different experience with holidays than we do. He's from Hagerstown, Maryland, and the high school name is still well known up there. I was up there a couple of years ago, and but this is a guy later in years. He was a younger man at the time that he ran the Knoxville Register, but he ran something very interesting in 1833, a poem on the front page of his paper called Thanksgiving Day. And that's the very front page of the Knoxville Register in June of 1833, not in November. But it's interesting that this first prominent reference to Thanksgiving in Knoxville history was not exactly what we might think it would be. It was rather cynical and irreverent. Anyway, I'll read it to you. It's not very long. Thanksgiving Day. Turkeys meet their fate and die. Chickens turn to chicken pie. Geese no longer gabbling fly, boarding clouds and rain. Don't you hear the proclamation bringing barnyard desolation? Death to half the feathered nation on Thanksgiving Day. Seize each glutton, seize a chair. None but gluttons can be here. May heaven bless our glorious fare. Clatter knives and forks. What for turkeys roast or raw would not jackknife strongly draw? Glutton stand or glutton fall for heaven's glory. Strutting turkeys meet, pompous geese, stuffed goslings meet. Chicken-hearted boobies eat, brother chickens now. Eat the broken fragments up, gormandizers seize the cup. Here's the health, hiccup. All is over now. It's not signed except with the interesting abbreviation UT OBS. It's a darkly cynical poem, a real mystery why they would have this irreverent poem on the front page of a newspaper. This would have, if I've worked for newspapers, weekly newspapers in the past, and we would have gotten in trouble at Metropulse if we'd run this on the cover of Metropulse. This is how can you be so irreverent toward this religious holiday? But it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that it is so irreverent, and one is in the city or town, I should say, only a couple thousand people lived here. In this town that had no record of Thanksgiving tradition, that we don't know that that Thanksgiving was even celebrated in Knoxville. Here's a perspective by someone who is not even familiar with the basics of it, but is really sick and tired of it. I'm pretty interested in what that might imply. And I think the only reason you would do something like on the front page of your paper is if you were ridiculing something that was not about your subscribers, but there was something about something far away. And this, I think people in 1833 thought of Thanksgiving as a hypocritical Yankee holiday, something they did up in the Northeast. We'd read about it and heard this interesting paradox of the idea of worshiping the Creator at the same time being a glutton and doing everything, breaking what might seem the rules of a more pious religious faith. But anyway, it was a completely interesting puzzle, and it's just by itself. There's nothing else in that whole decade really suggesting much about Thanksgiving in Knoxville. Then I kept reading it through newspapers, and in November of 1840, I found an essay called "A Day of Thanksgiving" that seemed promising. But it turned out to be actually it was in November because it was right after the election, and it was some Whigs had written this piece proposing there should be a day of Thanksgiving because the Democratic regime of Jackson and Van Buren had been defeated in the November 1840 election. Well, now it's the 1840s. Enter a woman named Sarah Josepha Hale. She was born in Massachusetts in 1788. Grew up with the Thanksgiving tradition. She had a tough life. She was widowed at age 34 with 5 children. So she was a single mother for most of her life. She never remarried. But she set about to prove that women could do a lot of things on their own, and had a remarkable career. She was a writer and editor. She wrote for a publication called The Ladies' Book, which later became known as Godey's Lady's Book. It's kind of too bad that she wrote a lot of things, wrote some novels, wrote essays, and it's too bad that sometimes the short fingernail versions say that she wrote "Mary Had a Little Lamb," and in fact she did. She wrote that poem for children. But she was kind of a proto-feminist. She was not really radical in any way, but she wanted to prove that women could stand up for themselves and make a living on their own, in especially in journalism. And she was also an emancipationist. She was opposed to slavery, and that was another aspect of her career. In her late 40s, she began a one-woman campaign to found a national holiday. And if there's any one person who's regarded as the mother or father of Thanksgiving, it would be Sarah Josepha Hale. This may have been prompted by something that I didn't know about until just this week when I was prepping for this talk, that William Bradford's narrative of the first Thanksgiving was unknown up until for a long time. It had been lost in the 18th century. It had and actually rediscovered in an obscure house in London that in 1844, I believe, and it was brought back to America and was a cause of great interest. Was republished in the 1850s, but this was the narrative of the Thanksgiving feast that we know about, and I think this may have. I'm sure Sarah Josepha Hale caught wind of this somehow and got interested in this idea of creating a national holiday of what had been this kind of a sectional oddity, which, as we know, it had often been made fun of in the earlier part of American history. But she's famous now for her influence on President Lincoln, and the National Thanksgiving holiday in 1863. But she had already, by that time, she'd already had influence for about 20 years on promoting Thanksgiving through the states. And she had influenced several states, and perhaps including Tennessee. I don't think it's just a coincidence that all these things started happening at the same time. Her name, by the way, is mentioned. She was not completely unknown in Knoxville. Her name appears occasionally in the 1840s, but she has another connection to Knoxville that I did not realize until this week. We have told stories before, especially with the help of our colleague Paul Brown, about the early literary career of Frances Hodgson Burnett, who began her career as a teenage writer here in Knoxville. When she was only 18 years old, she was selling her first short stories and helping support her family here on that. But this was, guess who her editor was at Godey's Lady's Book, the very, very first story she ever had published. Her editor, as you see on the cover, was Sarah Josepha Hale, the same lady who convinced Lincoln we need to celebrate Thanksgiving as a national holiday. And it was Sarah Josepha Hale who actually questioned Frances Hodgson of Knoxville. Said she thought that when she got this, she said, "This is so good, you must be plagiarizing, because this seems like a British story." And Frances Hodgson said, "Well, I'm actually from England. I'm only 18, but I'm from England, and that's why I write in that style." But anyway, she was very impressed with this and published it and published her. Well, actually, she never turned down a Frances Hodgson story. So this is an interesting Knoxville connection to this woman who probably never came as far south as Virginia in her life, but she was aware of this place and at least one talented person who lived here. But she began mailing governors across the nation, including the governor of Tennessee, whose name was Governor Aaron Venable Brown of Tennessee. This is this guy who got a letter from Sarah Josepha Hale in 1846 and was apparently convinced. I think he might have missed a couple of things, as some people made fun of him in the way that it was actually proclaimed that year. Knoxville, by the way, in 1846 was a small town without railroads and only limited steamboat traffic. There were maybe as many as 2,000 people living here, and the Knoxville Register was Mr. Heiskell's former paper. He had left that and was doing other things by that time. was located at Gay and Main Street near where the Riverview Tower site is today. But after high school, had left the paper. Perez Dickinson, a prominent businessman here in Knoxville from Massachusetts, originally invited two fellow New Englanders to Knoxville to come run the newspaper. He brought down two brothers, and I'm sorry we don't have pictures of them, brothers James Moses and John L. Moses, who were from Exeter, New Hampshire, which had always been big on Thanksgiving from early days. Exeter is very close to Boston. In fact, James had worked in Boston as a printer, and that's why Perez Dickinson thought that they would be good people to run a paper. And but the Moseses are well known in Knoxville for a few things. One is that they, and this is pretty surprising, that these guys from New England came to Knoxville and were surprised that there was not a Baptist church in town, and set about to found a Baptist church. They were founders of First Baptist Church. These New Englanders came here in the 1840s and did that. But they also were involved in lots of things. The Moses Center in Mechanicsville is named for them. But also one of them, I think it was James, was on the committee that planned Market Square in 1854. And I've always wondered whether he planned it based on what he remembered about Faneuil Hall in Boston. But it was the original market house was like a miniature of Faneuil Hall, perhaps. Anyway, it was interesting that the influence of these editors, because they became big proponents of Thanksgiving in years to come. There was an announcement in their paper about each new state that was beginning to celebrate Thanksgiving. They mentioned that Georgia and South Carolina were celebrating Thanksgiving Day, and then Kentucky in 1846. By the end of the year, and I think it was after most people had actually begun celebrating Thanksgiving, that this governor, Aaron Venable Brown, declared that not the last Thursday in November, but the last Sunday in December would be Thanksgiving in Tennessee. It would be a day of thanksgiving, humiliation, and prayer. By humiliation, he doesn't mean being embarrassed. He meant humiliation usually implies fasting, and it's a very kind of a abstemious sort of a thing to do, to endure humiliation in honor of something, and of course, fasting is the opposite of feasting, and that's why the Moses brothers kind of gave him a hard time, even though they liked the gesture of bringing in Thanksgiving to Tennessee. They corrected him and said, well, it should be in November instead of December, and it should be on a Thursday instead of a Sunday. And they made they try to set things straight. This is the Moses brothers editorial. Sunday is the best day of the week in its place, but it is not the best for all purposes, and is not quite as appropriate as Thursday for feasting and rejoicing among friends, for cracking nuts and jokes, to say nothing of shooting turkeys, without which, and a good many other things too numerous to talk about, the occasion to one who knows what a good old-fashioned Thanksgiving Day is would be just no Thanksgiving at all. And the Moses brothers knew what a good old-fashioned Thanksgiving Day was, because they were from New Hampshire, but they were kind of pushing this idea, and also the specific ways to celebrate Thanksgiving as they had grown up knowing it. And they also printed at this time, printed Washington's Declaration of Thanksgiving in 1789 to show that it was also a patriotic holiday. It was probably the first time that I've ever known that Washington's Declaration of Thanksgiving in 1789 was printed in Knoxville was by the Moses brothers, talking about celebrating this what seemed in Tennessee a new holiday. But they anyway they kind of made fun of Moses for not Moses of Brown, Governor Brown, for getting fasting and feasting mixed up. That he implied that this is they thought of it as a feasting holiday, and he was implying that it was a fasting holiday, which is of course just the opposite. Anyway, he didn't last very long. He was a pro-war governor, pro-Mexican War, Mexican-American War, and was this a war that became less and less popular, as many wars do, as it dragged on. And he lost the next election to another Governor Brown, a guy. Is he the next one, Paul, or we have something else? Yeah, Neil S. Brown. This is no kin Aaron Venable Brown. Neil S. Brown was the 12th governor and governor for 2 years, and he announced in 1847 that they were going to have Thanksgiving Day again, but this time it was going to be at a more conventional time, the 25th day of the month on a Thursday, as a day of thanksgiving and prayer. And this was reported, by the way, 2 days before the day, 2 days before the holiday. If you wanted to imagine preparing a Thanksgiving Day, and it's going to be, it's, by the way, it's day after tomorrow. That's exactly what they did in 1847. They figured people were quicker on their feet, and they could plan a big feast if they could put their minds to it. He mentioned most of the states of the Union have selected the same day. This is the Moses brothers saying, "We hope the governor's suggestions will be carried into effect." And then the next day, Thanksgiving Day, the Register politely reminded us, it will be recollected that tomorrow, Thursday, is the day set apart by the governor to be observed as a day of public thanksgiving throughout the state. Appropriate religious services, we understand, will be held at several churches in this place on Thursday morning. But they kept kind of pushing Thanksgiving. Paul, do we have another article or two? Yeah, this is one of their promotional things, a national Thanksgiving. This is most of it's copied from another paper, but they were saying, kind of hoping that this would become a national holiday, and it's not just something that was that governors of Tennessee would decide to do day after tomorrow or in late December or something like that. But they wanted it to be a regular thing. And next one, Paul. We have finally, and this is what I just read, the actual announcement of this early Thanksgiving Day, perhaps the second Thanksgiving Day ever celebrated in Knoxville. And again, this is before the Wikipedia sources will tell you that Thanksgiving started in 1855. Later than this, and it became a bigger deal in 1855. But I just want to mention that there were some Thanksgivings before that. They tended to be more religious, perhaps, than they are now, and I can't tell how much of a feast was involved. But if the Moses brothers had their way, they knew that it was a feast day. Anyway, the Moses brothers retired from journalism, went into other things. Where journalism wears people out, as I know from experience. It doesn't pay well, and it takes up all your time. It's not surprising that people worked as editors for 10 or 15 years and then quit. But they were still involved in lots of things in Knoxville, but just not in journalism anymore. But a guy who was involved in journalism was a fellow named Parson Brownlow, who had just arrived in town about the time the two Moses brothers were quitting journalism. He in 1851 he sort of liked Thanksgiving, but he saw some problems in it in terms of the indulgence involved. He was a fairly Parson Brownlow requires about an hour introduction, and we may do that one of these days. I was talking to one of Parson Brownlow's descendants the other days, and saying that we ought to do a joint program about Parson Brownlow. Just introduction to Parson Brownlow would take a full hour at Maple Hall or somewhere. And we will do that, but I'm not going to do that tonight. Parson Brownlow was a Methodist parson who had extreme political views on both left and right, but was an interesting fellow who sort of was interested in Thanksgiving. And I just want to he mentioned Thanksgiving briefly in 1851 and approved of it, but it was just typically for him buried in a political essay. He mentioned Thursday was Thanksgiving Day, appointed by the governor of the state. That was presumably the new Governor William Campbell of Sumner County, who was like Brownlow, who was a Unionist Whig in years to come. And here's Brownlow said, and also by the governors of 25 of the 31 other states. So Tennessee was not one of the last states to adopt Thanksgiving. There were 5 others that apparently didn't celebrate Thanksgiving in 1851. He reported, all the business houses were closed and divine services were performed in the various churches. This all looks well and seems appropriate morally, socially, and politically in a Christian people. We should acknowledge with humility our lasting obligations to the supreme ruler of the universe, for the blessings of civil and religious liberty, and for food and raiment. But it did seem to me that there was a little too much liquor drunk on that day. True, the parson allowed, it rained all day and was cold and otherwise disagreeable, which formed a sort of excuse for drinking. So Parson Brownlow did not approve of drinking, among many other things. But he thought this was maybe something worthwhile that might deserve some more attention. We had a major sea change in 1855 when it became a regular thing to celebrate Thanksgiving in Tennessee, and that was when Governor Andrew Johnson declared it to be a holiday. It was 1855 was the year Knoxville achieved railroad connections. We had the city was going really fast. We had maybe 5,000 people by that time and a few new factories in town, and it became kind of Thanksgiving became an actual thing. But he proclaimed it again, kind of breaking the rules of what we expect for December the 6th, not in November. And we have just a little bit of record about what happened here in Knoxville. There was rather than all the different churches having different services, they had what they called a divine service, which was an ecumenical service at First Presbyterian Church. And I think the reason they had it there was it was a brand new building. And we have an image of that, don't we, Paul? The first, here we go. This is the first Presbyterian Church as it was then, in the same place where First Presbyterian Church is now. Actually, this building was right next to the modern church, which was built as kind of an homage to the style of this church. The current church has a big gable on top. But it still has some of the Ionic columns in the front as well. But this is where the chapel of the First Presbyterian Church is. But that's where they had an ecumenical service for everybody in town, all the Christians in town, to come together and hear a sermon by Thomas Humes, who was not a Presbyterian, although he'd been raised Presbyterian in an Irish family. But he was an Episcopalian. And this is Thomas Humes in later years. Of course, he was later the president of UT, but in 1855 he was an Episcopal rector at St. John's, and I think the First Presbyterian was probably a bigger building at that time, and they brought everybody into the building, and he gave a sermon, which to my knowledge does not survive, But anyway, it's interesting that this was a day that you went to church, and at least in Knoxville and probably in other places, Tennessee, that it was mainly still a religious holiday. And again, there's not much mention of pilgrims, and this is interesting that there's not that. But I think when William Bradford's rediscovered book was republished in 1856, you do start to see that more. But in 1855, there was an interesting line in a paper that said, we presume our citizens will properly observe this day, and as is customary, allow a suspension of business on the occasion. So this was, as is customary, implies that they remembered having taken the day off in years, perhaps only back to 1846. Anyway, but I found something just today, literally, that I thought was interesting. Parson Brownlow spent most of his time here in Knoxville, but he occasionally got a while here and traveled. But he was really interested in Henry Ward Beecher, the abolitionist, although he was not an abolitionist himself at that time, but wanted to go up and hear him preach in New York. And he went up there in 1859. And wrote back to his readers in Knoxville from New York at Thanksgiving. He said, this is Parson Brownlow talking. This is Thanksgiving Day, and a day it has been to such onlookers as myself. That kind of implies that he's not really uh, uh, celebrating Thanksgiving, but he's watching it. Every day this week, the eastward trains and steamers have borne thousands from the city to their old homesteads and paternal firesides in New England to enjoy an old-fashioned, puritanical Thanksgiving among relatives. And to Parson Brownlow, puritanical was not a pejorative. He liked puritanical. And it's also interesting to mention that even in New York, people were going to New England to celebrate a real Thanksgiving because that was where the origin of it was. And it was kind of a new thing in New York, but it was still considered more of a New England thing. This old anniversary, with its festivity, its mirth, its drunkenness, its reunion, and over and above all, its pious recognition of the great engineer of the universe, I like that, was first imported from New England and is intended to remind us of the sterile, ocean-lashed shore of Plymouth. But my God, how it has been desecrated this day in New York by low excess and the indulgence of vulgar appetites, by floods of mean whiskey and showers of profane oaths. Here, as in most parts of this great nation, Thanksgiving has degenerated into mad revel, stupid excess, profane swearing, and riotous demonstrations disgraceful to the country and the parties concerned. That's Parson Brownlow on a New York Thanksgiving in 1859, a very dramatic time in American history. Anyway, what happened next is interesting. Sarah Josepha Hale was still very active in trying to petition the next president, Abraham Lincoln, to consider making Thanksgiving a national holiday, which was the biggest step in the whole evolution of Thanksgiving as a holiday. To her, that was the final goal. That's what she wanted to have to create. And Paul, we have what's the next picture? There's Lincoln, and he got Sarah Josepha Hale's letter. And just like a couple of governors in Tennessee, perhaps he said, "Well, I can't say no to this," and he actually declared it a national holiday right in the middle of the Civil War. The first Thanksgiving, there was a national holiday, nationally celebrated Thanksgiving on the same day, was on November 26th, 1863. Now, you don't need to know a whole lot about Knoxville history to know that that was an extremely dramatic time here. November 26th, 1863 was Knoxville was in the top page of the New York Times. It was the center of attention of the nation because it was a Union city surrounded by Confederates who were besieging it. So this was a weird time for Union people in Knoxville to be celebrating the Thanksgiving as ordered by Abraham Lincoln. And General Burnside obediently issued his General Order Number 32, which was basically that all the soldiers should celebrate Thanksgiving. And what that meant, I think, has been very pithily described by Dr. Digby Seymour, the late historian, as a full ration of bullets and a half ration of bread. Knoxville was being starved on the first Thanksgiving because Knoxville did not have as many sources of food as it usually did from the countryside because it was almost completely surrounded by Confederates. Some food was coming in through the river system and rafts coming down the river, but they definitely had much less food than they usually had access to here. So this was a tough thing. The battle was 3 days later. And but here's a picture of Knoxville as it was with you see the Union fortifications around there, and just outside of those fortifications were 17,000 Confederate troops who were intent on besieging and eventually invading Knoxville. So it was a very tense time that saw a successful resolution for the Union troops under Burnside. With the successful repulsion of the Confederate charge 3 days later, which was a bloodbath for the Confederates, and they had a terrible mistake on their part, on Longstreet's part. But anyway, that's so we had maybe of all the cities that celebrated the very first Thanksgiving in America, Knoxville's may have been the single most dramatic location for that. But I was frustrated though because I've looked in the 1840s and 50s and I saw mainly church services happening. I don't doubt that they had some people had Thanksgiving dinners like the Moses brothers had proposed in the 1840s as an old-fashioned Thanksgiving as they had known. But there's the first evidence I found of ingredients for a Thanksgiving meal came from a really, really unlikely source, from a place called T Hong, Hong. It was a place that here's, by the way, Knoxville in the 1860s, a great kind of lithograph based on a photograph, we think, of Gay Street. T Hong was around the corner it was eventually on Gay Street, but it was on Market Square in the late 1860s. T Hong was called that because it specialized in importing Chinese tea, and they called it a T Hong. And they even had a sculpture of a Chinese guy in the front of the store, very colorful sculpture. But it was run by a guy who was described as a Portuguese Jew named Victor Hugo Sturm. Fascinating guy. I would love to find out more about him. Some people say he was actually from Germany. Sturm sounded like more of a German name, but he was and to be Jewish and also be a godson of a famous French novelist is a pretty interesting thing. I don't know if we can find out more about this guy or not, but he was a well-known merchant here for about 20 years, and ran this fascinating store. And here's how he described what he had for Thanksgiving. And this is the very first time that anybody in Knoxville that I know of ever advertised for the Thanksgiving holiday meal by Victor Hugo Sturm. Sturm advertised everything that is rare and choice for your Thanksgiving dinner, such as celery, grapes, mincemeat, oysters, sardines, new figs, new raisins, all kinds of jellies and preserves, almonds and other kinds of nuts, all kinds of cheese, all kinds of crackers, all kinds of French fruits in their own juice, English pickles and sauces in great variety, cranberries, choice butter, the finest potatoes in the world, new hams, new beef, the choicest family hams, and all other articles that may be needed. And it's pretty fascinating to think that I can see all of those things, with the possible exception of sardines on a modern Thanksgiving table. But he kind of tapped into something there, and I think knew what people were looking for. But we see more and more after the Civil War, more about references to the Thanksgiving we are more familiar with, the feast, the reference to the Pilgrims. You see more of that in the 1870s and 80s, but also fireworks. That's interesting that Thanksgiving was known for fireworks, as were almost all holidays, with the possible exception of Easter, had fireworks connected to it. And fireworks were either sometimes so deafening that churches and having Thanksgiving hymn singings were getting annoyed that you couldn't hear the actual music for all the detonations outside the stained glass windows. But anyway, I want to end this with a pretty fascinating another sort of a menu from the Knoxville Cookbook of 1900. This was written at the very end of the 19th century that introduced Thanksgiving to us. And just look at this. And I looked this quote up. This is actually a quote from the 17th century British poet Abraham Cowley, with a few friends and a few dishes dine, and much of mirth and moderate wine. And keep track at home of how many alcoholic drinks there are in this menu. Oysters served in square blocks of ice, lemon, celery, puree of asparagus with whipped cream, sherry. That's the first one. Have some sherry, then have some baked fish, cucumber salad, and sauterne. That's a wine. Chicken souffle in cases, claret. We're up to three now. Three drinks in your Thanksgiving meal. Roast turkey stuffed with chestnuts, cranberry sauce, macaroni, corn, Roman punch. And I had to look up Roman punch. It's something. It's a rather pagan concoction, kind of like a champagne mimosa, complicated with additional fruit juices and rum and brandy. It's I don't know if it's any better than a Long Island IC or something like that, but Roman punch is a pretty serious drink. Roast quail, celery salad, then champagne. Individual ices, cake, coffee, and creme de menthe. So I've counted 6 alcoholic drinks for the late 19th century Thanksgiving dinner menu. Um, but uh, but anyway, however you celebrate Thanksgiving, and if you try this, please let me know after you recover from your hangover, and let me know how it worked out. All right. Thanks for coming tonight. Any questions at all from anybody? All right. Well, thanks very much for joining us, y'all, and appreciate it. And have a good Thanksgiving.